As Condoleezza Rice makes her 7th trip to the Middle East this year, Palestinians and Israelis are still deeply divided over the need for a precise agenda ahead of a peace conference in the US. Can Washington bring both sides together? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm David Foster. Is peace even a fraction nearer? Condoleezza Rice's latest visit to the Middle East has revealed the huge gulf that still remains between Israel and the Palestinians before the next much-vaunted summit can even begin. Dr. Rice has been meeting both the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and, a day later, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, in a bid to give some kind of momentum to the peace conference planned for next month in the United States. Well, while Mr. Olmert won't commit himself to the scope of those discussions, Mr. Abbas wants to see a clear plan in place.
The agenda should be drafted ahead of the meeting, and this conference should not be a photo opportunity. Everything should be clearly formulated during the conference, and after the meeting we should resume negotiations according to a timeline in order to prepare for a peace agreement.
Well, the US Secretary of State acknowledged that more work needs to be done ahead of the summit to bring the two sides together, but insists that a viable framework for talks already exists.
I sense the seriousness and the commitment of both President Abbas and Prime Minister Olmert. I know the commitment of the teams that they have appointed, the very senior people that they have appointed to lead these delegations suggests to me that this is the most serious effort to try to end this conflict in many, many years.
Well, what makes a predefined agenda so important? The so-called joint statement would address key issues ahead of the November meeting. Among those issues, borders of any future Palestinian state, the right of return of refugees and the status of Jerusalem. The Israeli Prime Minister Olmert's told Rice he doesn't believe the statement's necessary or a condition for having a meeting in 6 weeks. But the Palestinians say it's essential to have a document that covers the main and outstanding issues between the two sides before any negotiations at the Annapolis conference. Joining us now from Ramallah in the West Bank, Hassan Al-Khatib, Vice President of Birzeit University and a former Palestinian Authority Minister of Planning. In Jerusalem, Gerald Steinberg, Chairman of Political Science at Bar Ilan University. He's previously advised the Israeli government on negotiations with the Palestinians. And from the US capital, Washington, D.C., Paul Sham, a senior analyst at the Middle East Institute. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask each one of you the same question in turn. And rather than go through the sort of rather overworked questions that we've heard time and time again about this, I want you to be positive, if you can. For one, starting with you, Paul Sham, ahead of an expected November conference, is there anything to be positive about?
The most important thing that's happening is that the conference, the negotiations are actually being pushed by Washington and that the Palestinians and Israelis are talking to each other. This is something that has not happened since January of 2001. So the fact that there is a recognition of the need to address that issue is in itself positive and can help to create momentum. That is not a sufficient condition, but it is certainly a necessary one.
All right, Hassan Al-Khatib in Ramallah in the West Bank. Have you got anything to smile about at the moment from a Palestinian point of view?
Well, to be positive, I think that the fact that the two sides have agreed to resume the bilateral negotiations marks an end and a failure of the unilateral approach that Israel pursued for the last 3 years, which was responsible for catastrophes in the relations between the two sides and contributed to the radicalization process within the Palestinian internal politics.
And Gerald Steinberg in Jerusalem, it seems to be the opinion of the other guests that talking is actually sort of a very positive outcome. Anything else?
Well, I think that's a good start. perhaps also we're beginning to see societies, and particularly on the Palestinian society, start to deal with the really tough core issues where there's going to have to be compromise. To the degree that Palestinians are talking about giving up their claims on right of return, refugee claims, rewriting their narrative, understanding that they're going to have to share Jerusalem, that Jews have a long history and legitimate rights in Jerusalem that have to be dealt with, that's a huge change on the Palestinian side. It'll take a long way to go, but as Israelis hear those echoes and begin to also grapple with those compromises that Israel has to make, that's a positive step. It may take 5 or 6 years.
Paul Sham, it seems to be generally agreed that concessions are going to have to be made on both sides. That's one of the reasons why we've taken so long to see any kind of outcome at all. What are the major concessions, first of all from an Israeli point of view, that you think have to be made?
Well, the way things are looking now, a consensual agreement would probably require many Israeli settlements in the West Bank to be dismantled, to be evacuated, and to have some sort of swap of land of the larger settlements, which would remain in Israeli control, with parts of Israel proper inside the Green Line, and also some sort of division of Jerusalem. And the question is whether politically both sides are ready for these compromises. We saw what happened when only 8,000 settlers were evacuated in Gaza a couple of years ago. Now there would have to be many more in some sort of organized way, and it's difficult to imagine this happening quickly.
All right, stop there. I'll come back to you in just a second for the Palestinian viewpoint. I want to put that to Gerald Steinberg. Is there any room for manoeuvre from the Israeli point of view over what Paul Sham has just said?
Well, I think there is. That is certainly being discussed, but Israelis are also going to look very carefully at what Palestinians do. There will be a lot of anger among a small group of Israelis, but if there's a package that says this is the end of the conflict, we are no longer rejecting Israel's right to exist, we accept legitimacy of a Jewish state, a two-state solution, we've reached agreement on all the other issues, then I think the evidence shows that Israelis will be ready to take what are always called painful compromises, and that clearly includes dismantling of significant settlements, but also the land swaps and the parts that Israel will maintain and will continue to build on. That will be part of the agreement. So that is part of the Israeli dialogue, discussion, discourse now, and it will not reach any kind of agreement in 6 weeks. If Annapolis tries to go too far, it's going to fall on its face. Also, of course, it depends on the end to terrorism. We're still getting rockets being fired from Gaza. We're still getting suicide bombing threats that are coming out of the West Bank. So Israelis will also have to see this really means end of conflict, and then we'll be able to go from there.
Paul Sham, what have the Palestinians got to give up?
The Palestinians, as Gerald said, would have to accept explicitly a limitation on the right of return, which would mean virtually no returnees, perhaps some. The question I have is whether Israel is willing to compromise on the narrative, in other words, to split the right of return and the reality of return. And this is something that has been discussed by Palestinians privately for many years, but can they go public? The other aspects, I think, would have to bring in the Arab countries as, in a sense, guarantors of that. And also, the huge question is how to deal with the Gaza Strip, which is under the control of Hamas. Can Hamas be brought in, or is there some other way of dealing with it? Gaza cannot be under siege forever.
Hassan Al-Ghatib, talking to us from Ramallah. What's your view on that?
Well, I don't agree with the specific concept of compromise that was presented earlier. I think that this conflict can be only solved on the basis of the international legality. There are specific stipulations of the international law that needs to be integral part of the terms of reference for the negotiations, and there are specific resolutions of the Security Council that cannot be compromised and has to be respected, and the negotiations has to be about implementing them.
But give up the right of return, is that at all feasible, to give up the right of return?
If the Palestinians have the right of return according to the international law and the United Nations resolutions, then I don't see why the Palestinians should give this right. If the Israeli settlements in the Palestinian occupied territories in 1967 are illegal in the eyes of the international law and the particular relevant resolutions of the Security Council, then it has to be removed, and the Palestinians will never come up with a position that has a ceiling lower than what the United Nations or the Security Council resolutions are giving to them. And if Israel is under the illusion that what the Palestinians could not accept during Camp David can be accepted now, particularly these Israeli demands of a Palestinian ceiling that is below the international community's position, then I think that Israel has to look more carefully into the Palestinian political position. And the current negotiators reminded us yesterday and today, actually, in public statements, that the Palestinian position is going to be based on the international legality, and that the relevant Security Council resolutions are going to be the terms of reference for the Palestinian negotiators. That means that the Israeli settlements are illegal and needs to be removed. And the negotiations is supposed to be about that. However, there are possibilities within the Palestinian position to solve the problem of part of these settlements through swap. Swap based on one-to-one, equal in quality and quantity. Well, when it comes to the refugees issue, sorry.
No, just finish your point, I beg your pardon.
When it comes to the refugees issue, the Palestinian refugees have rights that are guarded by the international legality, and these rights has to be taken in a serious way by the negotiators, Israelis and Palestinians. And the Palestinians are not expected to give up these rights because it's guaranteed by the international law.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a little bit later on about whether those rights might be waived to some extent if there's a form of compensation written in, which is one argument that I've heard. But right now we're going to take a short break, and when we come back we'll talk about the ability of Mahmoud Abbas, Olmert and Bush to make a peace deal. Some suggest they're too weak to make anything stick. Stay with us on Inside Story.